Good afternoon, or I guess good morning, depending on what time zone you're in, where you're calling in from. Today's webinar is on the subject of ISO 45001-2018, where we'll provide a high-level overview of the changes between this standard and its predecessor, OSAS 18001-2007. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I have a brief agenda on this screen. We'll talk a little bit about PJR, who we are, what we do. We'll move right into the benefits and drivers for certification for a health and safety standard like ISO 45001. We'll cover migration information and a timeline of events for clients who are migrating from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001. We will discuss the key changes at a high level and then get into a more detailed clause by clause overview of some of the more significant changes. We will close the presentation with a summary of a couple other related changes that coincide with the publication of ISO 45001, an overview of the certification process for anyone who is not migrating from OSAS 18001, but is instead pursuing certification for the first time. We'll give you an idea of what that process looks like. And we'll close with some time for questions. So feel free at any point during the presentation to type your questions into the question field in GoToWebinar, and we will save those for the end. A copy of today's slides and a recording of today's webinar will be made available on PGR's website in the next couple days. So keep an eye out for that if that's a resource you are looking to get a copy of. So Perry Johnson Registrars, just really briefly, is one of the leading registrars in the world. We certify companies to a variety of standards as a certification body. We have clients all around the world. This is not an all-inclusive list of countries, but certainly gives you an idea of our global reach. And again, we're accredited to grant certifications for a variety of standards, including ISO 45001, which is the subject of today's webinar. There are a variety of other standards. I have some listed here in case you are interested in pursuing other standards and would like an integrated certification scheme. I do want to note that we're accredited to ISO 45001 through UCAS already, and we are also pursuing accreditation through ANAB. That process is still ongoing, but we are already accredited through UCAS. So we're conducting ISO 45001 audits and issuing accredited certificates. Benefits of getting certified to a health and safety standard like ISO 45001 include the ability to meet legal requirements, improving the organization's occupational health and safety performance and providing a safe environment in which to do business, driving management commitment and employee engagement, benefits around business management, including meeting stakeholder requirements, improving public image, achieving the organization's strategic objectives, and being able to integrate the system with other business management systems. There can be benefits related to supplier health and safety performance as a result of maintaining an ISO 45001 certification. Such a certification can also provide a competitive advantage over competitors who do not maintain a health and safety certification. Another benefit is the minimization of risk and production delays. It can also provide other financial benefits beyond the competitive advantage we mentioned earlier, including possible cost savings from liability insurance premiums. In some areas, there may be a discount associated with maintaining a health and safety certification. Specifically, ISO 45001-2018 drivers would include a commitment to occupational health and safety and the prevention of injuries and ill health, reduction of risks and hazards for employees, contractors, etc. Other business management drivers, including an improved public image, and providing a framework for meeting customer and/or regulatory requirements. ISO 45001-2018 replaces OSAS 18001-2007, as I mentioned earlier. It defines the requirements for establishing, implementing, and maintaining an occupational health and safety management system, abbreviated OHSMS, throughout the standard and this presentation. ISO 45001 provides a framework for an organization to control its hazards, reduce the risks of accidents, injuries, ill health, and/or downtime, and continually improve its processes and operations. The standard was published in March of 2018, and it is a voluntary certification. It's not a required certification by OSHA or a regulatory body in most areas anyway. If you are migrating to ISO 45001 from OSAS 18001, there is a 3-year migration period from the date of publication of ISO 45001. OSAS 18001-2007 certificates have been revised to reflect this expiration date if they wouldn't be expiring before that. PJR issued a transition plan on this subject with deadlines based on the publication date. In order to avoid a lapse in certification, PJR also communicated their own internal deadline by which migration audits should occur. This ensures sufficient time for corrective action response by the client and certification review and decision-making activities by the certification body. PJR recommends migration during clients' regularly scheduled 2020 audits. What this means is if everyone waits till the last minute to migrate, sometimes we have an auditor shortage or other resource shortages, which may lead to a lapse in certification. If we don't have the package completely closed out from the audit and a certificate issued before the expiration date, then there would be a period of time between its expiration and the issuance of the new certificate in which the client would not be certified. We also have to allow time for any nonconformities that result from the audit to be resolved with acceptable corrective action plans and implementation if they're measures or if they require implementation. So that's where this deadline comes into play, trying to make sure the audit goes early enough to allow for all of these activities to be completed and a new certificate issued before the previous certificate expires. Migration audits can occur during surveillance or recertification audits in the case of ISO 45001, based on the client's preference and their 2020 audit schedule. Please note a minimum of 1 audit day has been added to each migration audit for verification of the transition requirements. And this is a requirement of the ISO 45001 transition plan that all certification bodies have to follow. I put that information into a timeline. Sometimes a visual representation is a little bit easier to understand. So the standard has already been published. Our auditors have been trained. We have already begun auditing to the new standard. We are no longer offering new registrations, new certifications to OSAS 18001. And we're almost at the point where we are not offering audits to OSAS 18001 at all. So as you can see, in the middle of 2020, our goal is to not be conducting any more OSAS 18001 audits. So all audits taking place after that date are supposed to migrate to ISO 45001. The deadline to migrate is March 31st, 2021. This is an extension oh, excuse me. So March 31st, 2021 is the deadline to migrate, 3 years from the publication date, and the certificates become obsolete on that date if they have not already been reissued as an ISO 45001 certificate. And that's what we discussed before, trying to ensure no lapse in certification. Ideally, everyone would have their migration audits in 2020, so we don't have a resource strain in early 2021 to try and get these audits to take place. Getting into the specifics of the ISO 45001 standard. The ISO 45001 standard is an ISO standard, which means it follows the Annex SL structure found in all of the current revisions of ISO standards, ISO 9001, 2015, ISO 14001, 2015, for example. As the ISO standards are being updated or have been updated, they have all adopted this Annex SL structure so that they follow the same format and utilize the same common terms. This helps make them easy to integrate. Here is a copy of the Plan, Do, Check, Act model, which is slightly revised from OSAS 18001, 2007 and found within the standard. At a high level, the key changes in ISO 45001 include the adoption of the ISO structure, the Annex SL structure we just discussed, an emphasis on leadership accountability, and involvement, which we'll discuss in more detail as we move through the presentation, a focus on risk management, and really taking a proactive approach to risk identification and management. There's an emphasis on objectives, measurement, and change, some changes to the communication and awareness requirements in the standard. And overall, the standard is less prescriptive than OSAS 18001, meaning it gives a greater level of flexibility for the organization to determine how it will implement and meet the various requirements of the standard. There are a number of terms and definitions found within ISO 45001. We will not be reading through these during today's webinar. I've included them in the slides, trying to highlight some of the more important parts or the relationships between terms. The only one I do want to note, because we'll see it a couple of times throughout the presentation, is under the Occupational Health and Safety Management System definition, or OH&S management system. We see a note that indicates that the intended outcomes of the OHSMS are to prevent injury and ill health to workers and to provide safe and healthy workplaces. We will see the phrase intended outcomes throughout the presentation. A lot of the requirements or the verbiage in the standard relate to the management system's effectiveness regarding its ability to achieve these intended outcomes. So this would be an important term. When we see intended outcomes, we want to be familiar with what that represents: to prevent injury and ill health to workers and to provide safe and healthy workplaces. That is the intended outcome of the OHSMS. Top management will also be an important definition to become more familiar with when we talk about leadership accountability requirements. And again, all of these terms are found within the standards, so feel free to review them in more detail. We'll also talk about documented information in more detail once we get to that section of the standard. So I'm just going to skip through those terms. I mentioned some high-level changes or some of the key changes in the standard, and we'll talk about them in more detail. In terms of how the standard is broken down, there are changes to the strategic occupational health and safety management. So there's an increased prominence of occupational health and safety management within the strategic planning process expectations for the organization. Leadership, like I said, there's an emphasis on leadership. A new clause has been added to the standard. You can see that in the Annex SL structure, to assign specific responsibilities for those in leadership roles to promote health and safety management within the organization. And again, when we get to that section, the top management definition will be important to become familiar with. I mentioned a couple slides ago that ISO 45001 calls for a greater level of proactivity. So the expectations for organizations have been expanded to commit to proactive initiatives to protect the health and safety of workers and interested parties, consistent with the context of the organization. So that means to the extent that they are able to impact those things. This might include things like hazard identification, risk assessment, emergency response, operational controls, and monitoring and measurement. I believe I also mentioned earlier there's a shift, a greater level of focus or emphasis on performance. So with regard to continual improvement, there's a shift in emphasis from improving the management system itself to actually improving the health and safety performance of the organization. The communication requirements have been changed, giving equal emphasis to both external and internal communications. So that's changed from OSAS 18001 as well. And I mentioned that documented information contains some changes that we'll discuss. Specifically, this reflects the evolution of computer and cloud-based systems for running management systems to incorporate the term documented information, which replaces the terms documents and records, such as in the case of ISO 9001, to give organizations a greater level of flexibility to determine when procedures are needed to ensure effective controls. So instead of specifying when a company needs to document a procedure or maintain records in a specific media, this term documented information gives a greater level of flexibility for the organization to make those types of decisions on their own. And as long as the process and the controls are effective, and that can be verified through the audit process, then that would be an acceptable methodology. So at this point in the presentation, we're going to go through the clauses of the standard in a little more detail when there are more significant changes. We're not going to go through every single clause, but certainly we'll try and hit on the high points. Clause 4 covers the context. 4.1 requires that the organization determine internal and external issues relevant to the occupational health and safety management system and its ability to achieve its intended outcomes. We did talk about that term earlier, so this is one of the first times that that comes into play. 4.2 requires the organization to determine which interested parties are relevant, not just their workers, and what the needs and expectations of those interested parties might be, some of which will translate to requirements of the management system. When determining the scope of the management system, those issues, those internal and external issues from 4.1 and the needs and expectations from 4.2 need to both be considered when determining the scope. And some of these concepts will be familiar to you if you're already familiar with ISO 9001 2015 or ISO 14001 2015. This might seem familiar to you. As I mentioned, there is a clause solely dedicated to leadership, and that is new. So clause 5 focuses on leadership and worker participation. 5.1 requires that top management, and again, you can refer to that definition to understand how the term applies to your organization specifically. Top management should, among other things, take on more responsibility for the effectiveness of the occupational health and safety management system, the integration of OH&S management into business processes, the adequacy of resources, and the communication of conformance to the OHSMS. So that really, at a high level, highlights the expectations for top management and leadership within the organization and what they're going to be accountable for. The policy and objectives need to be aligned with the organization's strategic direction and achieve the system's intended outcomes. So there's that term again. The OHS policy inclusion requirements now include a commitment to participation above and beyond what was already required in OSAS 18001. That would be the only significant change to the policy criteria. .3 covers the roles and responsibilities. The standard no longer mentions a management representative. Again, if you're familiar with OSAS 18001, this is a change from that standard. Top management needs to ensure adequate responsibilities and authorities are assigned, whether that is to one person or a team of people. A management representative is no longer required. Responsibilities can be delegated by top management, but ultimately top management is accountable for the occupational health and safety management system, and that is a key change to the standard. So all of the things that the standard verbiage requires top management to take on or allocate as far as responsibilities go, even though they're delegating those responsibilities, or if they delegate those responsibilities, they are still ultimately accountable for the effectiveness and the outputs, the performance of the management system. 5.4 focuses on participation and consultation, both of which are terms found in the standard. And the criteria for these in ISO 45001 is more specific and prescriptive than in OSAS 18001. So this is certainly an area to take a closer look at if you're migrating to see what additional items would be required. Some examples include identifying methods, training, and resources, identifying and removing or minimizing, if removal is not possible, any obstacles to participation, such as fear of reprisal or language barriers. And it also emphasizes non-manager participation and consultation in a variety of areas, such as the identification of hazards and risks, incident investigation, etc. So again, this is an area to take a closer look at within the standard verbiage. Clause 6 focuses on planning, and this entire section has been restructured. Planning and risk determination must take into consideration both positive and negative, as well as the identified issues and the needs and expectations of interested parties from Clause 4. The focus on the planning section is achieving the intended outcomes of the system. The risks and opportunities need to be determined in order for the management system to achieve its intended outcomes. You see that term again. Also to prevent or minimize undesired effects, including injuries and ill health, and to continually improve. Risks and opportunities need to be determined related to hazards, legal and other requirements, and risks and opportunities that can affect the achievement of the intended outcomes. So the extent to which they have an impact. If they don't have an impact or they have very little impact, then that would not be as significant as something that can have a large impact. The hazard identification requirements in ISO 45001 are more prescriptive and proactive, requiring consideration through the hazard identification process of a variety of factors. Just a couple examples are listed here. People in the nearby area who can be affected by the organization, people at the workplace who are not controlled by the organization, work areas, equipment designs, actual and/or proposed changes affecting the occupational health and safety management system, and past incidents. Those are just a couple examples, but it certainly highlights the proactive tone of ISO 45001, requiring that organizations go a bit further in their planning, in their risk assessments, to step maybe outside of the four walls or however many walls the organization has, to really look at the impact they can have and those intended outcomes. These two clauses, side by side in the standard, or one after the other, require assessment of occupational health and safety risks and occupational health and safety opportunities, respectively. So the standard requires a process for each of these to be assessed, relevant to, in the case of risks, relevant to the identified hazards and existing controls with established and proactive criteria. And in the case of opportunities, relevant to the occupational health and safety performance, including opportunities to improve the work environment itself and/or to reduce or eliminate hazards or risks. In the case of the risk in 6.1.2.2, documented information is required to be retained as evidence. So as we'll get into a little more detail later, that documented information term gives a greater level of flexibility as to how the organization is going to prove that it has a process to assess those OH&S risks and that it's been implemented. 6.1.3 requires up-to-date determination of and access to applicable legal and other requirements. Not only do organizations need to know which requirements apply to them, they also need to determine how the requirements apply to them and to the organization's hazards and risks. So what do those requirements really mean? What do they require the organization to do or monitor or report on or communicate? How does it apply to the organization? In amongst that determination, there might also be determination of communication requirements. Sometimes those legal and other requirements go hand in hand with a communication requirement or require communication of some nature of certain information or at a certain frequency to a certain party in the event of such and such. So identifying those communication requirements is important as well. Six 6.1.4 covers planning of action. This needs to address the risks, opportunities, legal and other requirements, emergency situations, level of integration into the OHSMS, and evaluation of effectiveness. So this is just a high-level overview. You can take a closer look at that section. It takes into account the hierarchy of controls, which is not changed from OSAS 18001, but just make sure that when planning action for the management system, you're taking into consideration all of these required criteria. In terms of occupational health and safety objectives, nothing too different here. It needs to be consistent with the policy, take into account legal and other requirements, now risks and opportunities as well, and the participation and consultation results. It needs to be monitored and measured if possible, be communicated, and be updated as relevant. Nothing earth-shattering here. The standard does specify that the organization needs to determine and maintain documented information of the following: actions or tasks to be used to achieve the objective, any resource needs, the responsible party or parties, a completion timeline, monitoring methods and measurement frequency, the results of evaluation methods, and methods for integrating into the OHSMS. So this requirement would be more specific than OSAS 18001. I see someone has their hand up. I'm not sure if that was an accident, but please do go ahead and type a question in if you have that, if you have a question, and we will be saving them for the end. And again, just in case anyone gets kicked off or is having audio issues, this is being recorded and will be made available on PJR's website in case that's the reason for the hand up. Moving on to Clause 7, which focuses on support. Competency and awareness requirements have been separated with awareness criteria prescribed in ISO 45001. The commitments to occupational health and safety protection are to be given more consideration in regards to communication. External representation and reporting must be controlled. And Clause 7 is also where we'll find more information about documented information, which takes into account the use of modern recording media. So we'll look at these in more detail. 7.2 is where the competency requirements can be found. The organization must determine competency requirements for workers that can affect the performance of the occupational health and safety management system, and competence must be evidenced through documented information. So this gives the organization a greater level of flexibility, but they do need to determine what those competency requirements are and then have documented information to back that up, that the workers meet those competency requirements that have been determined by the organization. 7.3 identifies specific items workers need to be made aware of by the organization, including the real or potential ramifications of deviating from the management system requirements. So this is more prescriptive than OSAS 18001. So you'll want to review 7.3 and make sure your training and awareness and communication processes take all of that into account. No significant changes to internal communication requirements. External communication requirements are given equal emphasis in ISO 45001, as I mentioned earlier. So the standard requires the organization to determine the relevant internal and external information and communication requirements. Specifically, who, when, how, all of those details about the communication requirements need to be determined. External interested party views, when relevant, are also to be considered. 7.5 is where we find specifically the documented information subject. So this section identifies specific controls to be identified by the organization related to creating, updating, and controlling documented information. No significant changes to the concept of document control in the subsections of the standard, but again, the documented information term replaces documents and records to give the organization a greater level of flexibility instead of specifying everywhere that a documented procedure is required, for example, or prescribing a specific type of record media. The organization has more flexibility to determine how they want to maintain that information. And as long as the audit process can assess the implementation, the maintenance, and the effectiveness of that process, then it should be acceptable. Clause 8 focuses on operation, so operational planning and control. Planned actions must have established process criteria with sufficient documented information maintained to ensure process criteria were met. So again, throughout the standard, we see this documented information term giving a lot of flexibility, but the caveat to that is it has to be effective. There has to be evidence of a process in place, whether you have a documented procedure or not. That process has to be clearly implemented, that all the criteria assessed and established, and we need to be able to audit that process has been identified and implemented and maintained. So when you're thinking about what type of documented information you may require, make sure it's sufficient to that end. We need to be able to audit, in this case, process criteria were established and met effectively through that type of documented information or through that process for the requirements of the standard to be met. I mentioned earlier that there are no significant changes to the hierarchy of controls that can be found in 8.1.2. That's the same as OSAS 18001. 8.1.3, however, is new to ISO 45001. This is the management of change concept, which requires the organization to implement a process for controlling planned changes that could affect the occupational health and safety performance of the organization, as well as review and mitigate any negative impacts of inadvertent changes. So this is new to ISO 45001. This is strong, important language requiring a management of change process. Some examples that might trigger the management of change process include, but are not limited to, new products, services, or processes, changed working conditions, such as adding a new shift, working different days of the week, working different times or different times of year, or in different types of environments, maybe changes to PPE, let's see, changes to equipment, changes to legal and other requirements, etc. So that's just a couple examples, but the management of change process is a really important tool, and it also echoes the tone of proactivity highlighted in ISO 45001 to show that instead of reacting to changes that have been implemented, reacting to the impact on the management system, whether positive or negative, you are proactively reviewing and assessing those risks, identifying what, if any, changes could affect the system and what controls might be necessary before implementing the change so that you can ideally or theoretically avoid any negative impacts to the system, such as injuries or incidents or even near misses, by taking that proactive approach. There are requirements related to procurement, including requiring processes and controls for outsourced processes that could affect the occupational health and safety performance or the management system itself. There are requirements related to contractors to identify and control occupational health and safety risks related to the activities of contractors. And this can go both ways. This can include the impact on workers by the contracted activities, or vice versa. It could relate to the impact of the organization's workers and activities on contractors and their work. It also requires that contractor selection criteria be identified and a process be in place to ensure contractor activities meet the requirements of the occupational health and safety management system. So it's not enough to say, they're not our employees, there's nothing we can do about it, or, they have their own processes, we have no say. That's not how the standard sees it. Since you have choices related to which contractors you utilize, for example. Continuing on with this idea, the standard also requires identified controls to ensure procured materials and or services also meet the requirements of the standard and don't prevent the standard or the system from meeting its intended outcomes. 8.2 focuses on emergency preparedness and response. No significant changes. There are some additions to the items required to be considered, possibly included in the emergency response process. Review and revise, if needed, procedures after drills or emergency occurrences. Identify relevant training, including first aid, and consider the needs and capabilities of all relevant interested parties involved. Clause 9 focuses on performance evaluation. The organization needs to determine the occupational health and safety management system's relevant monitoring and measurement requirements, again, specifically the who, when, how, all of that good stuff, to evaluate the occupational health and safety performance and the effectiveness of the management system. So you really need to go through the process of determining those requirements to flesh out the specifics and have enough documented information to show that those determinations have been made. In terms of the internal audit process, 9.2.2 specifies some factors that need to be determined within the audit program. There might be some changes there to your current process if you're migrating from OSAS 18001. So take a look at what those factors would be. It also requires results be reported to relevant managers, workers and or representatives, and other interested parties as relevant. This may or may not be a change for your organization. Similarly, regarding management review, there are some additions and revisions to the inputs and outputs required for those reviews to be performed by top management. So I might sound like a broken record, but take a look at that top management definition to make sure all required parties are involved, and then take a look at that section 9.3 in the standard to see if any revisions to your inputs and outputs for your reviews are required based on the revisions in ISO 45001. Clause 10 requires identification of opportunities for improvement. Again, we see that ISO 45001 is proactive in nature. 10.2 requires timely action to address and correct, if relevant, any incidents and nonconformities. Corrective actions must be reviewed for effectiveness and have evidence through documented information. And this section also requires, again, similar to the internal audit, that the results be reported to relevant workers and/or representatives and other interested parties as relevant. 10.3 focuses on continual improvement, and ISO 45001 requires continual improvement of the OHSMS by improving the occupational health and safety performance, creating and maintaining a culture that supports the OHSMS, participation of workers in implementing controls that drive improvements, communication of results to relevant individuals, and maintaining evidence of actions and improvements through documented information. At the end of the standard, there is also Annex A, which is guidance on the use of the document, and a bibliography. We will not be focusing on either of those today, but they are at the end of the standard for your reference and use. Okay, I mentioned earlier that there are a couple other changes related to the publication of ISO 45001. I just really briefly want to cover those before we get to the overview of the initial certification process and any questions that you guys might have today. So IAF mandatory documents are more relevant to the certification bodies. These two documents were published in conjunction with the release of ISO 45001, and some of the requirements ultimately trickle down to the clients. So I thought this would be a good avenue to bring some of those changes to your attention. One of those key changes impacting our clients would be the concept of notification of significant change. So we have seen a lot of times in the past that clients will often wait until their audit is actually taking place and their auditor is on site to bring up some changes that have happened since their last audit. And significant change is probably a term that most of you are familiar with. The idea that some changes can't be made on the fly very easily. If it's something that could impact, for example, audit time calculations, if it has to do with increases or decreases with employee count, the addition of shifts, a move, or an addition of another facility to the certification scheme, the significant changes cannot wait until the next audit. You need to notify PJR's program management in writing as soon as possible if you're a client of ours. And again, this is coming from these IAF mandatory documents that certification bodies are required to adhere to, but this is one of those requirements that trickles down to our clients. So please go ahead and get in touch with us in a very timely manner when these significant changes are taking place at your organization, or even if you know they're coming in advance, feel free to reach out to us so that we can prevent any negative impacts to your audits or your certification status. We really want to try and get ahead of those. It is not always possible to scramble and make the necessary changes after the fact. I want to mention also that there is a prescribed audit timetable communicated by these documents to calculate audit time based on risk level and employee count. So there are changes to this timetable compared to OSAS 18001, which in most cases will have your health and safety audit time increase. And again, I wanted to make everyone aware that those requirements are across the various certification bodies that we have to adhere to this requirement. It's not a timetable that we have created internally as a certification body for our own use. Echoing the emphasis on top management accountability and involvement in ISO 45001, these mandatory documents require top management to attend the closing meeting, if at all possible. This is arguably the most important part of the audit, the closing meeting, where we talk about how the audit went, its strengths, its weaknesses, any findings, any follow-up actions necessary, really how the audit went overall and how effective the system is at that time. So if top management cannot attend the closing meeting, we'll have to document an excuse for their absence, which should be reasonable. So you might be asked in your upcoming ISO 45001 audits about this if top management is not in attendance, and that is where this requirement is coming from. And again, this goes hand in hand with the emphasis of top management accountability. Certification bodies may need to conduct special audits in response to compliance or other issues such as incidents, and it could potentially lead to suspension or withdrawal of certification. That is really specific to a case-by-case basis review, but it is in our terms and conditions that we reserve the right to conduct those audits as necessary, in addition to your regularly scheduled surveillance cycle. If you are pursuing certification for the first time, legal compliance violations could potentially impede or prevent that certification from being issued. Overall, these documents raise the bar related to performance expectations for the occupational health and safety management systems, just like ISO 45001 does as a standard. It's more proactive in nature and does raise the bar related to performance expectations. Okay, so really briefly, for anyone who is not currently certified to OSAS 18001 to migrate to ISO 45001, but is instead pursuing certification to ISO 45001 right off the bat, I just want to go over the what that process looks like, that initial certification process. So you'll need to establish a system of documentation or documented information that meets the requirements of the ISO 45001 standard. You'll conduct any training that's required. You'll implement the requirements that you've established and the requirements of the standard, including conducting an internal audit, a compliance evaluation, and that management review or the system review. The system review needs to include the outputs of the internal audit as an input to the review. So make sure that the internal audit happens before that system review. You'll also need a contract with a certification body such as PJR to conduct your audits. You will have a stage 1 audit and a stage 2 audit, which we'll talk about on the next slide. Address any resulting nonconformities before a certificate can be issued. So the stage 1 audit is a documentation review or a documented information review to make sure that the framework is in place to meet the requirements of the standard and to ensure that the organization is ready for their stage 2 audit instead of going right to the stage 2 audit where we've got a lot of time and travel booked. We do this stage 1 to assess the readiness and make sure that we're not proceeding to stage 2 prematurely. Stage 2 is an audit of the entire management system. The implementation of those standard requirements or that framework reviewed at stage 1 to see if you're doing what you say you'll do and whether it's effective in meeting the requirements of the standard. It's possible that your stage 2 audit could result in nonconformities, which would need to be resolved through the corrective action process before a certificate could be issued. Certificates are good for 3 years, so after the issuance of that initial certification, you would be on a surveillance cycle, which could be annual or semi-annual, depending on your contract and the client's preference in most cases. These surveillance audits for the following 2 years represent partial system audits, whereas the stage 2 audit covers all processes and all shifts. It's a full system audit. These surveillance audits would be a sampling of roughly half of those processes. We don't necessarily have to sample all the shifts or all of the processes at those audits. We try to cover everything between those 2 years of surveillance audits. And then on the 3rd year, the recertification audit is again a full system audit that results in a new certificate, ideally. Similar to the stage 2, we cover all the shifts, all the processes, and that restarts the 3-year certification cycle. Some clients are on a multi-site certification scheme where you have multiple locations doing the same activity. Some standards, we also have campus schemes. This is something that would be part of the quoting process if it's relevant to your organization versus having individual certificates for each location, which is possible as well. There are pros and cons. Similarly, we have integrated versus simultaneous audits. If you have an integrated system, if you have multiple standards to which you're certified or pursuing certification, and those systems are integrated, if you have, for example, a shared system of documentation, you do one internal audit that addresses both standards, things like that. If the system is integrated, time to audit both at the same time can be discounted. Otherwise, if they're not integrated and you still are pursuing both certifications, we can do those audits together in most cases. The time in those cases would not be integrated. So it's important to accurately represent whether or not your system is integrated before we decrease audit time and then find that that is not in fact the case. And again, that's something that we can discuss in more detail during the quoting and scheduling processes to make sure we have a representative overview of your system and we've applied only appropriate discounts. Okay, that is the bulk of the presentation. If you haven't already typed your question, please take the time to do that now. I'm going to continue on to the next slide that has our contact information and leave that up for the duration of the presentation. So if you have any technical questions that would be best discussed outside of this webinar, you can contact either myself, Austin Matthews, or our EHS program manager. Her name is Stacy DeSantis. We can both be reached through PJR's main number. We I have both of our email addresses on this screen. If you are a new client looking for a quote, you can reach our sales department through the phone number on this slide as well. And we can go ahead and get that process started, give you an idea of what paperwork will be required and how long your audits would be, when we could potentially get those scheduled, things like that. So let's go ahead and see what questions we have. Okay, our first question is whether it is possible to integrate ISO 45001 with ISO 27001. So when you are asking about integration, I'm assuming you are referring to the last slide that I just had up. Your question was from earlier in the presentation. I'm wondering if this slide I just had earlier might have answered that question. So if you have multiple certification schemes or standard certificates and your system is integrated, we can conduct integrated audits and discount time. If you're pursuing certification to 2 different standards and the systems are not integrated, we can still perform both of those audits, and sometimes we can get them to coincide if that's easier for you. If you don't want several audits throughout the year, based on our auditor availability, we might be able to do both of those audits, but time would not be discounted if the systems are not integrated. So it really depends on how your system is set up. And again, we can look at that in more detail from a technical perspective based on your specific management systems if you go ahead and contact us outside of this webinar. The next question is, do you offer lead auditor certification course? At this time, we do not have the ISO 45001 lead auditor course. We did just publish an ISO 45001 clause by clause course, which would result in a training certificate after you complete the modules and the exam. It is not a lead auditor course. At this time, we are not offering that. That is something that I can ask about if that's something that we'll be offering down the road. It's not something we have at this time. We have a question about a site breakdown with 3 headquarters and 20 sites, asking about how the certification would apply and how these sites would have to be sampled. That is something best discussed offline. I may not be the best person to answer that. We have a lot of paperwork and spreadsheet calculations that we utilize to determine how many sites need to be sampled, at what frequency. So that would be something we would have to discuss offline. So feel free to reach out to me and I can point you in the right direction, or you can get in contact with our sales team to try and get some of those questions answered. I apologize, this just isn't the most appropriate format to discuss that. Does PJR have any training on OSHA itself? That's a good question. I don't believe we do. I remember having to take an OSHA course outside of PJR's training availability. So I would guess not. It's something, again, that I can confirm. All of our training opportunities are also on PJR's website. So if you're ever looking for training, that would be a good place to start, review the available training that we have. We offer free webinars on a variety of topics. OSHA is not one of them. But again, any training opportunities that we have, whether in a formal course or these free webinars, would be available on PJR's website. So you can take a look there. Okay, we have a question about continual improvement. So I want to go back to that slide. Okay, so the question is, can you give any examples for continual improvement related to 45001? So that's a pretty broad question. The continual improvement requirements are found in 10.3. And again, they're looking for continual improvement through improvements to the occupational health and safety performance, creating and maintaining a culture that supports the OHSMS, participation of workers in implementing controls that drive improvements, communication of results to relevant individuals, and maintaining evidence of actions and improvements through documented information. So just looking at that list alone, participation of workers in implementing controls that drive improvements, that might be referring to suggestions that employees have, or when they're involved in the the risk assessment process, maybe they, again, make some suggestions or have some insight into the day-to-day operations of their job that someone in an office might not recognize. So taking those suggestions or those improvement ideas and implementing them, that would be an example of continual improvement. Improvements to occupational health and safety performance, that actual performance, the concept of injury and ill health, that could come from so many different avenues. If you are implementing a change in PPE or following the hierarchy of controls and removing a type of equipment that poses a more significant hazard and replacing it with one that poses less of a hazard, or outsourcing that risky activity to remove it altogether. Those are some ways that you might actually improve the performance. Not using a contractor who has a poor performance record. Those are some ideas off the top of my head. Next question, do you have a gap analysis for migration from 18,001 to 45,001? It's been a while since we first started this transition process. I would have to go back and look. I'm making myself a note. Chris, if you want to send me an email, let me go back to contact information. I will look for one if we have one. If you want to shoot me an email, if I find one, I'll know how to get in touch with you. We did communicate the transition plan to all our affected clients when all of this came out, and I would assume if we had a gap analysis tool, it would have been communicated in conjunction with the transition plan or made available on PGR's website in conjunction with the transition plan. But again, I will go ahead and take a look and see if I can find anything. Okay, next question. How do you verify real audit risk documentation in the audit? I am not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. You might be asking about how we assess the risk assessment process with the documented information definition being changed. That would be my best guess as to what you're asking. Feel free to contact me via email if I've misunderstood your question. In terms of auditing any of these processes without necessarily a documented procedure, again, we're looking at the outputs, the effectiveness of that process, or we're looking for evidence of an effective process. So we might conduct interviews with relevant personnel to see if they're knowledgeable about what the content of those would be if it were documented, what risks are relevant to their areas, how significant the risk, what controls might be in place or have been put in place, any training requirements. We would also look at, incidents to see if a lot of incidents are occurring or if they seem well controlled regarding those specific risks, to look at whether that process is effective. We would look at that from a couple different angles. So I don't want to spend too much time on that in case that was not in fact your question, but that applies in general to a lot of the requirements in the standard. With a greater level of flexibility to the documented information definition, we're going to be looking at whether the process outputs are effective, whether the system is meeting its intended outcomes, how the incidents and injuries are looking, and as always, talking to employees and providing a sampling. In some cases, you are still going to have documented processes or inspections or records that we can sample as well. It's not saying you can't maintain those, and a number of organizations will still continue to do that because it's just the way they've always done it, and it's easy to see right in front of them how things are going. So there's nothing that says you can't keep maintaining that same documentation if that's what works for your organization. The next question is, what are the main mandatory records? So again, the documented information term replaces the term record. So I would have to pull it up to be sure, but I want to say you won't find the term record anywhere in the standard. You'll find documented information several times, and that gives the organization the flexibility to determine how they want to show that evidence. So I would search the standard itself for that term documented information and see where it might be referring to the process itself versus the outputs, such as where it requires documented evidence of meeting the competency requirements and any actions necessary to close competency gaps. So if an employee needs competency in topics A and B, and they're put into that role with only competency A, then somehow you're providing that competency B and should have evidence of providing competency B and assessing its effectiveness. So that would be one example. I would review the standard in detail to see all the places where that documented information is referenced. I can't give you a list of mandatory records when records are no longer required in that form. There are some follow-up notes about if a customer says it's proprietary. I think you were clarifying your question, but again, I'm not understanding where that fits into it. So again, feel free to contact me. I apologize if I'm not understanding everyone's questions or some of these questions in here. Is employee medical test to be conducted on a yearly basis? I'm not sure what testing you might be referring to. If you're conducting screening for certain health issues, that would really be site specific and be based on your process and your risk assessment and the controls that you've implemented. So if you have some specific questions, we can talk more about that offline. Do you have a copy of the 45001 standard you can share with us? The standards need to be purchased through ISO, if I'm remembering correctly. So each copy would be your own. I'm wondering if I'm getting that mixed up with other standards. I don't think I'm able to share a copy with the standard. I think you have to purchase it through the ISO website. I'm pretty sure. So you can check ISO's website and look into purchasing a copy of the standard. Next question, is internal audit outsourcing possible? Yes, you can hire a consulting or auditing firm to conduct your internal audits. If you don't have anyone in-house that would be considered competent or qualified or independent enough to perform that assessment, you can absolutely outsource that. Okay, another question about what are the mandatory procedures and documents required by the standard. Again, I think I answered this already, but take a look at that documented information, or maybe even perform a search of the standard itself to see where that term comes up. You can also refer to Annex A, which is the guidance of the document, or provide some clarification. If you have some questions about how the documented information term might apply, you might find some clarification in Annex A, which mimics the structure of the standard and looks at each section providing some guidance. I can't give you a list of mandatory procedures or records when there is not one. Let's see. Manual and procedures are not mandatory according to the latest version of the standard, but do we need to document the departmental risks and opportunities management program like we document the short and long-term objectives of the company? So again, I can't tell you that you have to document anything is the point of this. The documented information term makes all of that up to you. What we'll be assessing as auditors is whether the process you've implemented is effective. If you feel the most effective way is to document it in a procedure or a spreadsheet or however you've been doing it, you're not going to be penalized for continuing to document something. The term and definition is flexible enough to certainly continue to account for the fact that some clients will still be documenting those things. So if that is what works best for your organization, or if that's the easiest way you think to be able to show those outputs, by all means, continue to document it. There's nothing saying that you can't. Will outsourced activities fall under the scope of OHSMS certification? Yes, it can. When you are looking at the standard, again, the idea is proactive, and we'd have to look at the actual verbiage in the standard. Again, feel free to contact me offline, but we could talk more specifically based on your organization, what activities you might be outsourcing, to give you a more definitive answer. But it all comes back to, you know, the things that the occupational health and safety management system can affect and its ability to achieve its intended outcomes. So when we talk about outsourcing and procurement and things in the standard, we talked about how outsourced activities need to still be meeting the standard requirements and the management system requirements. You have to have a process for making sure those outsourced or purchased products meet the requirements of the standard, or those services and processes that might be outsourced. So in general, yes, outsourcing can be relevant, and it would just kind of depend on what you're outsourcing and the extent to which you have control over those activities. It certainly at least needs to be considered. Okay, how does ISO 9001 and 13485 relate to this standard? I am actually not trained to 13485. I'm not familiar with that standard. 9001 relates to quality. So a lot of the requirements in ISO 45001, since they follow this ISO Annex SL structure, mimic the layout of the standard. There are a lot of things that can be integrated. If you have a manufacturing or production facility, for example, you might be subject to those quality criteria to make sure your product outputs are meeting the customer specifications, while also making sure that the manufacturing activities are being maintained, respecting those health and safety requirements, meeting OSHA regulations, preventing injuries and downtime, which can negatively impact the outputs of the facility and things like that. So they can certainly be integrated. Do they relate to one another? Not really, but the standards are set up the same way so that they can be integrated if both standards are relevant to your organization. There are a lot of similarities. ISO 9001 focuses on the quality management system, while ISO 45001 focuses on the occupational health and safety management system. We are not giving credit for this seminar. It's not a continuing education course. We have the ISO 45001 clause by clause course, which you can access through PGR's website. I recorded that one as well. There is an exam, and if you complete that course, you do get a continuing education certificate. So that course would count. This is just a free webinar that does not provide a certificate in the end. So I see a question again about proprietary documentation if a customer says it's a proprietary document. So if you're, again, I'm not sure what the question was in reference to. If you are utilizing a customer's proprietary documentation, if they're requiring you, for example, to use a specific, I don't know, inspection sheet, then if you're talking about controls for documentation, you would still be responsible for making it readily available to anyone who needs it, making sure it's the current version of the document. Other than that, I'm not sure what you might be asking. So again, just feel free to reach out to me. We have a question about outsourcing process control mechanisms examples. Depending on what you're referring to, if you're referring to how you are going to ensure the contractors meet the management system requirements, it could be through, for example, a contract that you have with that contractor company, spelling out the requirements and they have agreed to adhere to them. You might get an understanding of their training process or require evidence of training on certain subjects. Conversely, you might require contractors coming on site to sit through your own training process so that you can communicate what you need to. You might have someone from your organization working closely with the contractors and watching them while they work to make sure that they're meeting requirements and that they have that clear line of communication if they're having an issue or if they've had an incident or something along those lines. If you're outsourcing work and it's not being done at your facility, it might relate to some type of, again, contract or review of your expectations, what packaging requirements you might have, or what chemicals they're not allowed to use, what they need to wear PPE wise if they're coming on site. This could be so broad, it really depends on your organization. And I also need to remind everyone too that I am not a consultant. I'm an auditor. I work as an assistant program manager, but I have to be careful not to cross that consulting line too. If you need help specifically setting up your management system, you'll need to work with a consultant rather than an auditor. So I just want to throw that out there too. Two more questions, it looks like. Conducting a compliance audit is mandatory by the organization. A compliance audit is required by the standard to make sure you are maintaining compliance with the legal and other requirements that are relevant to the organization. We didn't necessarily cover this in this presentation. It's not different from OSAS 18001. There are no significant changes to those expectations. If your question is whether the organization needs to conduct it themselves, not necessarily. Similar to the internal audit, compliance audit can be outsourced to a competent party. So a compliance review is required. It does not need to be performed by the organization. As an auditor, how can we make sure that all legal requirements have been captured by the organization? So this documented information term, which we've talked about a couple times now in answering these questions, is very flexible, and it's going to be challenging as an auditor to follow some of these audit trails or ask the right questions to assess the effectiveness of these processes if an organization is choosing not to document procedures or document these outputs. But the process has to be effective. If they are having, if there are evidence of violations of legal and other requirements, if they are having inspections by OSHA yielding violations, if they are not aware of their reporting requirements, if they are not implementing those requirements, such as posting the necessary OSHA logs or submitting them, if they're not knowledgeable about the communication requirements that OSHA has, for example, I'm just thinking health and safety examples. OSHA is common, but there are others, such as local requirements related to their fire department. If they have an emergency response team, they might have legal requirements related to them. The landlord of their building might have requirements, maintaining the sprinkler system and the fire extinguishers. If they're not aware of these things, if they're not knowledgeable, if you can't see the outputs of those controls in an effective way too, to avoid, like I said, those violations, if you're seeing evidence of inspections yielding violations or communication of violations in any way, that would be evidence that the process is not effective. If employees are not aware, they're not trained, they're not knowledgeable about where to find information or how things are being monitored, that might be an indication that the process is not effective. There would be a variety of examples and ways to audit that. And again, if you are looking for ISO 45001 internal auditor training, I would expect that that would be discussed in more detail as well from an internal auditing perspective. Similarly, if you're auditing for a registrar, I would expect your ISO 45001 training as an auditor to cover that in more detail or be a good avenue to ask those types of questions too. Whew, that was a lot of questions today. Thank you guys. I don't see any more. So again, a recording of today's webinar will be made available on PJR's website. Thank you for joining us today. If you have not had your migration audit yet, good luck. I hope this webinar and its contents was helpful. And thank you for joining us today for the ISO 45001 webinar.